Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining me on today's podcast. My guest today is Katerina Apokatanidis. She is a PhD candidate at the University of Toronto, Department of Classics. She works with Dr. Sarah Murray on the archaeology of Greek funerary ritual and religion between the Archaic and Roman periods. She specializes in the materiality of the Orphic Gold Tablets and their role in Greek mortuary ritual. She obtained her bachelor's in Classical Philology at the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki in Greece. For her first master's at Durham University, she worked with Dr. J.H. Haubold on the role of women in the Hesiodic Catalogue of Women. For her second master's at the University of Waterloo in Ontario, she worked with Dr. A. Faulkner on the gender interplay in Nonnos Dionysiaka. I hope you enjoy today's interview and discussion on Dionysus and the Orphic Gold Tablets. It's very nice to have you on the show, Katerina. How are you doing?
I'm well. It's nice to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me.
So in today's episode, we're going to talk about Dionysus, Greek religion, and Orphism, as particularly the Orphic tablets. So before we get in, would you mind telling the audience a little bit about your academic background and what led you to the study of the Orphic tablets?
Yeah, sure. So I am Greek, and I did my BA in Greece in the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki, and that was in classical philology. And then I do have two MAs because I guess I was really intense about classics. And one is from Durham, England, where I worked on the Hesiodic Catalogue of Women. I'm not sure if you know what that text is. It's very fragmentary.
Mm-hmm.
And then my second master's was at the University of Waterloo in Ontario, Canada. And there I worked with Andrew Faulkner on Nonnos Dionysiaka. So that text from the 5th century CE. So yeah, I was really into epic poetry. I really liked epic poetry, but the reason why I liked epic poetry was because it talked a lot about the gods. So the gods were really my interest, where my interests lay. So when I got to Toronto for the PhD, I continued in philology, but wanting to do any work on the gods, which is sort of like basically like religion, like ancient Greek religion, wanting to do something like that, you can't just focus on texts. You have to do like everything. You have to look at all the evidence that is available. So you have to sort of be a historian as well as an archaeologist, as well as a philologist to sort of make sure that you're understanding the plethora of the evidence. So I made the decision to switch streams because Toronto has these like 3 streams for classics, and I went from literature to material culture because I was really interested in the gods. I was really interested in religion, but I was mostly really interested in the Dionysian religion. And
Mm-hmm.
that aside, I had taken a course on epigraphy at Thessaloniki when I was still doing my BA, and one of my favorite profs sort of introduced us to the Orphic tablets, and I hadn't known what those were before that time. So, I, needless to say, I fell in love with the tablets. They're really
Mm-hmm.
interesting texts and objects, like as items as well. So, and I noticed that when I switched to material culture and I told my profs, now material culture profs, right? So archaeology profs, that I really like these inscriptions, but there's really nothing new to say. They told me, well, why don't you look at the material properties? Why don't you look at them as archaeological objects? Have they been studied in that way? And it turns out that they haven't, because mostly people who know about them are philologists, and of course they work in philology, so they would look at them as texts, right?
Yeah.
As textual evidence. So
Yeah. And for the audience, explain philology.
philology is the study of ancient Greek and Latin literature. So it's essentially a literary thing to do. It's you are literary studies when you're doing philology, but it's in the ancient languages. So you have to know really well
Mm-hmm.
Latin and ancient Greek. And essentially, what you're doing is you're interpreting the texts from whatever chosen time period you would like to do. So, what you do is you perform a close reading of the texts in the original languages, and you try and figure out you try and to interpret basically the texts.
Yeah.
So that's what philology is. It's very specific. It's very literary. It always has to return back to
Hmm.
text, to the creation of the text, right? To the meter. It's very, very form focused. Um, you don't do philology in order to understand what happened in the past. That's basically the
Hmm.
thing that I was interested
Okay.
in. So yes.
And what are the Orphic tablets?
So
Oh, I'm sorry.
no worries. Yeah, so what are they, right? They are these really thin sheets of gold. Um, it's really thin. They're like 1 millimeter in thickness, so they're really, really like thin, really tiny. Um, sheets of gold that have inscriptions on them. They have a text that were sort of scratched onto their surface. And these were exclusively, as far as we can tell, found in tombs and in graves. Um, and essentially, they don't follow. That's as much as of a pattern as I can give you, because their shape, their size tends to differ. Where they were found in the tomb and in the grave differs. There's no overarching pattern, and even the text found on them is very specific, very individual. So each case is sort of its own thing, even though there are sort of talked about them in these like three main groups of text, but still they have a lot of variation on them.
Okay, so where are they located? Where do we find them? Like time period and place.
So they're found all over the Greek-speaking world, beginning in the late Archaic era and reaching up until the Roman imperial era, so second century CE, um,
Okay.
and throughout the Greek-speaking world in antiquity. So this means um, south of Italy, Sicily, the mainland in Greece, the islands of Greece, Crete, and I believe there was one found in Asia Minor, today Turkey, but it's in a museum in Smyrna, but no one has really there's no it's not it hasn't been published and there are no images
Oh,
online, so we don't know what is on it. Unless you went to the museum to see what it is. But yeah, it hasn't been published though. So
hmm.
those are the fine spots.
And what are? I'm sorry.
Those are the fine spots, and that's the era.
Okay. Okay. And what's typically written on these tablets? What's the purpose of them?
So one large category is a description of what the soul is supposed to do once it arrives in the underworld. So Hades' realm, what they're supposed to do, where they're supposed to go, and from which body of water they are supposed to drink in order to be free of the cycle of reincarnation on Earth. So this category basically tells us a little bit about the landscape of the underworld of Hades, which we don't really get in other textual evidence. Um, they tell us about the landscape, um, and they don't agree as to which is the correct body of water. Some texts from mainland Greece say that the correct body of water is, I believe, the lake of memory, whereas the incorrect body of water is the spring of oblivion. On the other side, so I think this is the way that they are separated. The Italian evidence gives us, again, they're all written in Greek, but they don't agree as to which body of water. They actually flip it around, so it's actually the spring of memory,
Oh, really?
yeah, and not the lake of oblivion. Regardless, though, they do agree that the first body of water you find as you're traversing the underworld is the waters of oblivion. So that is the body of water is whatever it is, be it a spring or a lake, you are supposed to not drink from that. Because if you do drink from that, you forget the life that you've lived. If you forget the life that you've lived, then you also forget all the growth that you've done, all the rituals that you've partaken in to sort of show the underworld deities and subsequently the entire pantheon that you are an initiate, right? That you know the reality of the situation, and we'll get to that. That you know the truth, so that you are able thus to not, you don't have to be reborn again. So the worst thing that can happen to you for the ancient Greeks is to be living on earth, is to be born. And this also does follow this motif of the souls of the dead being very thirsty. And this is a universal motif. This is found in cultures around the
Hmm.
globe that have no contact with each other. Um, Yes. So they are thirsty. So the dead are thirsty. So the trick is to not give in to your thirst and drink from the first body of water. That's the trap that the rest of the souls get fall into.
Hmm.
But now the second body of water, so you have to continue on, control your thirst, continue on, and then the second body of water, be it a spring or a lake, is always guarded and is always found next to a shining white cypress tree, because the cypress tree is the funeral tree for the Greeks, for the ancient Greeks. It's typically the wood was typically used for making coffins and stuff like that. But it's shining in the underworld. So there's this element to it that it is bright against the murky Hades, because Hades is murky, dark, and foggy at the same time. You can't see. Hades, the word sometimes people have connected it to unable to see, like this. Um, but in any case, it is a shining beacon. It's supposed to bring you closer to it, but it is guarded. So once you arrive there, you have to speak the passwords to the guardians. And if you speak the correct password, then they will allow you to drink. You can't just go up and drink from that water. This
And
is
what is the
all information
password? I don't mean to
on
interrupt,
the.
but what's the password? Like, what do you have to
So
say
the
to these
password
guardians?
Password is something along the lines of, like, the words sometimes are different, but it's essentially the same phrase. And the password is, I am the child of earth and starry heaven, but my race is heavenly, so allow me to drink from the water that you are guarding. And it is inferred. So this is in it's either child or daughter or son, depending on who the initiate is, who the deceased is. But that's the password. You speak the password, then you're allowed to drink from the waters of memory. So you remember who you are, you remember the life you lived, and thus you are allowed to further your journey in Hades and not go back to Earth to relive again. Um, so yeah, so this is all information found on the tablets, on one side, on one group of tablets. The other big group is those tablets tend to this one that I just explained. These tend to end where the text on the tablet is sort of speaking to the deceased, so it's in the second person singular. So someone is speaking to the deceased, and at the end, what happens is that they mention that now your honor, like your honor, I'll explain what that is wine. You are a Bacchic one. You are Bacchus. You are Vacchus, right? So you are allowed to then enter into the Elysian fields and not be reborn on Earth. So that's the one category. The other category skips forward, skips ahead, we don't know, to the audience that the deceased is supposed to have with the queen of the underworld, Persephone. And the idea is that you gain an audience with her to tell her that you are forgiven, rather to seek her forgiveness, but you tell her that the Bacchic one himself has released you, has released them, like the deceased. Because this is all going back to the mythos that I haven't touched on yet, but the idea is that
Hmm.
you're supposed to ask forgiveness from Persephone because the Bacchic one, i.e., Dionysus, has released the deceased, i.e., the deceased was an initiate of Dionysian mysteries, and whatever went on there, he or she is now considered to be released to be closer to the truth, based on Dionysus's teaching within those mystery rites. And yeah, and again, then you are allowed to, once she hears this, then you are allowed to enter again the Elysian Fields. And then the idea is that you dine with the heroes. So the Elysian Fields is a place in the underworld that not everyone has access to. And in fact, mostly just heroes have access to. Heroes being semi-divine children themselves. They are actually related by blood to the gods. So the fact that mortals that are not related like immediately to the gods can have access to the same feast table as the semi-divine beings in the underworld, right, in the afterlife rather, is pretty intense. It's very unique in the entirety of Greek religion.
So is this like revolutionary ideas? What we got? Has this contrast to Greek religion more broadly, or the popular sense? This seems like there's something parallel going on here, or this is esoteric versus the more exoteric forms of religion. How do we understand this in context of everything?
It's a very good question, and
Yeah.
scholarship is not agreeing as to
Hmm.
how we are supposed to understand this. But they all agree that the teachings that we find on these tablets, the information that we find on these tablets, is is revolutionary. We don't get this in any other aspect in Greek religion, in Greek religious thought, because it's very bleak. The idea, as far as we can tell, right, as far as we can tell from the surviving evidence, not taking the tablets under consideration now, as far as we can tell, it's very pessimistic.
The
No matter
Homeric
what you,
view.
yes, no matter what you do, you go to the underworld, you go to Hades, right? And that's it. That's just the way it is. Then you exist as a shade. So you don't want to sort of get to that point fast. You don't want to leave Earth, right? Because Earth is supposed to be the place of happiness and joy and the sun shining.
Hmm.
This is, as far as we can tell, right? We think this was the prevailing, the popular, the common thought, but it's actually appearing that I don't really agree. It doesn't seem to be the case as widespread as we might have thought, because we do have a lot of thinkers who are not connected to Orpheus, as far as we can tell again, that have already talked about what to do or how to change your life in the afterlife. This isn't something new per se, and the other mystery religion, which is very popular, is the Eleusinian mysteries, also has we can, from what we can understand, right, also has an element of a blessed afterlife, which means that you can actually do something to change your fate in the afterlife. So the more evidence we see coming into like finding, the more evidence we find about the eschatological beliefs in ancient Greece, the more our Homeric model, right, our model which was based heavily on the Homeric epics, doesn't seem to make sense. It doesn't seem to actually be the model that people were like ordering their lives around
I
in the
agree.
end.
Yeah, I think the emphasis on Homer is a little misguided.
The tyranny of the text, which is why I left the philology, because
Hmm.
Homer is important. Is not to say that his epics are not important for shaping ancient Greek society to a certain extent, but it's by no means the only one. And even then, we really have to be careful which Homer we're talking about, which version.
Yeah.
The Pisistratus version, like which version? Because a lot of the stuff that we find about the afterlife is in the Odyssey, at a point where scholars don't actually agree whether or not it's actually part of the original Pisistratus's version of the Odyssey and not a later interpolation. So it's very, we have to take Homer with a grain of salt when it comes to the afterlife, because Homer is not religion. It's
Yeah.
just about stories about heroes. Homer
Yeah.
is not the Bible.
Yeah, and I push back against the Homeric views because when we talk about like the history of religion, for example, and just going off topic, but it is related, like the idea of Christianity and like, oh, the Christianity was so revolutionary because you could have salvation and have a better afterlife, and then they'll use the Homeric view as a foil and say like, oh, this is what people all believed back then. You had this horrible existence, and then the mystery religions are kind of marginalized. I don't believe in that marginalization of mystery cults. I think it was more prevalent. It's just that, perhaps scholars wanted to create that contrast for that reason, like earlier scholarship, which was still Christian influenced. Like, this is just the things that I reflect on when it comes to ideas and history of religion. And, as we understand things better, we realize, okay, this was more widespread and it was probably more foundational to people. It's just that people had a choice of what mystery they wanted.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. The problem with mystery religions is in the name. It's
Yeah.
because they were mysteries. We don't know. They weren't talked about, but with the penalty of death, right? Like you could not. You were it was illegal to discuss, to write about this stuff. So the problem for us scholars is that a lot of the times we don't know what to do with their existence. We don't know how to deal with them. We don't know how to interpret them. So oftentimes they sort of get, especially if, and this is actually visualized in editions and in scholarly books about ancient Greek religion, where there's like so many chapters and pages ascribed to the Homeric view or to state religion and festival days and so on and so forth. And then we get to the mystery aspect or magic, the practice of magic, and those get maybe like 3 chapters in
Yeah.
an entire volume.
Yeah.
Um, and it's sort of always talked about as an afterthought, like this side of religion, because a lot of the times, again, as you say, um, we still, even in the 18th century, in the 19th century, but we still can't divest ourselves of the perspective of Christianity, which is what? Having an organized religion based on a book. Very, very much. So that's sort of a simplistic way to discuss what Christianity is, but that's sort of what it is. Organized religion, organizing masses, right, based on one book. Um,
Hmm.
this is not the case for ancient Greek religion, and in fact, it's not the case for many ancient religions, but it's even more so not the case about ancient Greek religion. So we cannot discuss it with the same terms that we use to discuss modern religion or Christianity. It's
Yeah.
doing something else. It's completely different, and the problem is that we don't know how. We don't know what words to use to describe.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
It's complicated.
some people have used the dichotomy of private religion, which is, mystery cults and magic and the practice of magic and stuff like this, versus state religion.
Hmm.
But even this dichotomy doesn't serve us completely, because it does help us figure out some things, but it mostly helps us figure out some things about state religion rather than about religion in general. Because a lot of the times, the people who were practicing privately, it was a prerequisite to have or to hold a religious office in the city state. So in fact, they're not segregated, but they are very much connected. Obviously, they are. Obviously, they were both
Yeah.
practiced by people. So it's hard, but I love it.
Yeah. It's fascinating. That's the great thing about studying the topic is that it's always giving more, over time, more insights, more revelation about the matter. Um, Now, here's a question. They're called Orphic tablets, but what makes them actually Orphic? Because they don't, the term Orphic doesn't appear on these tablets. So, what indications or why do we label them Orphic?
A very good question. Again, scholars don't all agree. In fact, they're called Orphic Bacchic tablets, but that's a bit of a mouthful, and I should have prefaced this entire discussion by saying I will be calling them Orphic for lack of better term. But
Hmm.
they're actually like they're officially called Orphic Bacchic because they're not just Orphic and they're not just Bacchic Dionysian. Um,
Now, okay, so because of that, what's the difference? So now, I guess there's a second layer to the issue. What is the dichotomy of Orphic and Bacchic?
so Bacchic comes from the word Bacchus, which is a term used as a title epithet for the god Dionysus. Vakos is his epithet, but it's his scary epithet. You don't, his neutral name is Dionysus. So when you talk about Dionysus, things are neutral. You're not invoking the wrath of his wrath, or anything scary, rather. Vakos is very different. Vakos is a heavy word. Um, you don't talk about Dionysus Bakhios in the same way you talk about simply Dionysus. Now, Vakos is also his name, not just as an epithet, but actually his name. And it's also only in his worship could a mortal take on his name. So, Vakos with a capital Vita is the god. Vakos with small Vita is a mortal following his worship. Once you get at a certain stage in his mysteries, in the Dionysian mysteries, in the Bacchic mystery cult, then you become yourself Bacchus. You have the right to take on his name. This does not occur with any other god in the Olympian pantheon. Nowhere. Um, that's the Dionysian side. We have some information about what probably went on worshipping this god, but we can get into that a little bit. The Orphic side of things with the tablets is even more contested amongst scholars because we believe there was a movement termed Orphism in the past, but this is not actually fully supported by the evidence. We know Pythagoras existed and we know Pythagoreanism was a thing, but we don't have the same amount or the same security of evidence for Orphism. And a lot of the time, scholars don't actually agree that this was a thing. This was not a movement. This was not a trend. It was probably just people following
Skeptics, the Orphic skeptics, right?
Orphic skeptics. They believed that it was actually Pythagoras who talked about Orphics and Orphic things. So even in the past, people are not sure whether or not Orphism exists as a movement separately from what is happening with the pre-Socratic philosophers like Pythagoras and Anaxagoras and so on and so forth. So the natural philosophers. The problem for this, I think, this is my own opinion, but I think the problem stems from the fact that we are using a term, a name that is found only in myth and not a historical person. So we are using Orpheus's name to describe a movement that he supposedly founded. So who is Orpheus? For those who don't really know, he is a mythical persona. He's a mythical figure found in myth, a Thracian from Thrace, ancient Thrace, and he supposedly wrote texts about how best to worship Dionysus, amongst other things that he's written. But he was also a very, very good poet. So Homer was one poet, right? Orpheus was another, and Orpheus was supposed to be this mythical figure that by singing and, playing his lyre, he could tame wilderness. He could tame beasts, gods, humans, the whole thing. Orpheus was a part of the Argonautic expedition led by Jason to retrieve the Golden Fleece from Colchis at the shore of the Black Sea. And he actually played a pivotal role because he put the dragon to sleep, the dragon that was guarding the Golden Fleece. He's also known from the story of him and Eurydice, where he went to retrieve his lover Eurydice when she died prematurely. He descended. He has a Katavases myth, a myth of a descent to the underworld, which is a genre of myths, not found only in Greek myths. So he descended into the underworld, and he convinced both Persephone and Hades because of his mourning song when he lost Eurydice. He convinced the gods to allow him to retrieve her soul back into the land of the living, with the caveat that he should not turn back and see her until they exit the underworld. And I think we all know this story. It's a very famous story where he actually succumbs, and right as they're about to exit the underworld, he turns to look at her, and then she disappears back into the underworld. And after that, he was able to leave the underworld. One of the very few living people, who could actually do this or who did this, in the myths. So he actually did, he left the underworld without, he failed. And after that point, we see in the myths that his life sort of went to, it sort of went to shit, for lack of a better.
Yeah.
There's this thing where at some point he turns against Dionysus and he devotes his life to Apollo. Some scholars believe that some ancient scholars and modern scholars believe that he was probably a son of Apollo rather than having anything to do as a descendant of Dionysus. Some people think he's a descendant of Dionysus. I don't know. No, we don't know. We don't actually know for sure. But in any case, the idea is that until the end of his life, he devotes himself to Apollo. He shuns or goes completely against Dionysus, and then that results in his literal dismemberment from Menads, who are female worshippers of Dionysus. They dismember him, they cut off his head, and then his head sort of trickles down and falls into the sea. This is in Thrace. This is still happening in Thrace, probably from around the mountain Pangaion, which is actually where I'm from. And then eventually his head lands on Lesbos, I believe, and it's still singing. So it's weird.
Yeah, he sang prophecies.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's who Orpheus is. He's a mythical figure. There's no person attached to him. But the idea is that he probably wrote some sort of text, hexameter poem, like Homer did, right? But for Dionysus. Nothing of this survives. All of our Orphic material, or rather the texts that we see following an Orphic theogony, i.e., a theogony that is not Hesiodic, that is not from Hesiod, those are much later sources. Even though those that have survived are much later sources, so they're dating after the Hellenistic age. Even though we know that these stories existed before, much beforehand, especially with the tablets themselves, where we see
Hmm.
actually names of deities in one of the tablets that refer to Orphic cosmogony and Orphic theogony. The words protogonos and phanis appear. Phanis and protogonos, firstborn, and phanis like the shining one. Those are concepts that are attributed to Orpheus and his cosmogony and not Hesiod. So that's a very roundabout way of saying we don't know what Orphism is. We don't know where it comes from, for sure, and but we know that it has something to do with Dionysus and his worship, um, hence the tablets.
Okay. Is there any connection to this to the Verni papyri?
So the Germanic papyrus,
Like
right?
the tablets themselves, or
The Germanic papyrus is the only other direct evidence that we have of this Orphic Bacchic cult that produced these tablets. This is a papyrus found in the Reveni, which is a small town near Thessaloniki, in Greece. And it contained the papyrus contains, it's the only papyrus found on European soil for obvious reasons. No papyrus can survive in Europe because the climate is too wet, especially in Thessaloniki. But this papyrus was burned. It was placed on a funeral pyre of the deceased in the grave that it was found in. And because of that, it wasn't completely burnt. So, but it became charcoal. So there's this process, right, where apanthrakóthike, it became like charred, and that made it
hmm.
survive. Of course, it's very fragmentary, but it was also like it was like a ball. It was really weird the shape that it was found in,
Mm.
and it's very fragmentary, and most of the endings of the lines are missing. And in fact,
Mm.
so what is it? The text itself is a commentary on an Orphic theogonic text poem in hexameters that we know was in circulation in many years before this third century where the papyrus was found in the Raveni. What is so it's a commentary on an Orphic poem, an Orphic hexameter poem, which means that by this point in time, people who were following this sect were not able to understand the text, the poem, needed a help. They needed interpretation. So this is huge because this means that the poem itself is very it's much older than we thought initially. Because by the time you get to the point where you don't no longer understand or can immediately recall, that means something, right? So the information found on this papyrus links the various versions of the information found on the tablets. There was no tablet found in the Raveni, to be clear, no tablets found in those groups of graves, but the papyrus was found. So this is important. This is another piece of direct evidence for this Orphic Bacchic cult, and it's the tablets and then it's this papyrus. But the papyrus has enough information to link what we find on the tablets together into one unified set. Because up until the Raveni, people didn't agree as to whether or not these tablets were even related to each other because they're very different.
And now, Dionysus, like, how do we understand him in connection to Orphism and his mysteries compared to, let's say, the popular understandings of Dionysus in myth? Is there a dichotomy there? Is there how many versions of Dionysus are there in that sense?
Do you mean that we understand or that they would have
I
understood?
guess, yeah. So you have, if you, let's say you have the Dionysus in the city, in the polis, and but then you have the Dionysian mysteries, and you have Orphic. Like, what are the different levels of the Dionysus? How do they
So
contrast to each other?
this is a good question. It's to be clear, right? This element is not unique to Dionysus. There are all the other gods as well have their, various levels of worship that exist for
Yeah.
like Apollo is, at Delphi, but he's also the god of medicine, um, stuff like that. So yes, there is Dionysus. He's found in the cities at the theater mostly, as well as in his temples. But the paramount space for Dionysus in the city is the theater, is the theatrical stage. Excuse me. And so, how do we reconcile him with the Orphic, right? What happens?
Because, yeah, I asked this because in the modern reception of myth, we think of the Dionysus as just this, intoxication and alcohol and ecstasy and all these. That's the popular idea, and there is an ancient precedent for that, for the obviously wine and then theater, but then contrast it with mysteries and how they connect together.
So we know Dionysus as the god of wine, first and foremost. I think that is his most famous attribute, wine.
Yeah.
He's also the god of theater, right? He's also the god, as you say, of ecstatic dance, of enthusiasmos, ecstasy itself. What is ecstasy? To stand outside, i.e., to stand outside of oneself. Enthusiasmos, do you know what that word means, where it comes from? En theo, the
Mm-hmm.
god, theos, entering, i.e., again, your body, entering you. Um, and these are all, it's not a coincidence, obviously, of course, that these are all attributes of a god who also is credited with the invention of wine. So because wine has the power to make you ecstatic, has the power to loosen the limbs, loosen your inhibitions, free you of the human condition, i.e., of being a certain person with a certain name, and to forget, right? And to have a good time. Wine also brings together people, right? Makes things more easy, makes things flow amongst people. This is the more common version of his myths. In this version, which is a Hesiodic, which is found in Hesiod's Theogony, the Dionysus is the semi-divine son of Zeus, and a princess of Thebes called Semele, which I'm sure people probably know. Um, if you recall, the most famous story of his birth is when Semele was tricked by Hera and requested that Zeus appear before her in all his divine glory. First, Semele made Zeus promise her that he would give her whatever she asked for, and then he promised, and then she asked for this, and then he could not go back, like he could not take his promise back because he swore, as when gods swear upon sticks, right? You can't go back. Um, so he appeared before her as a god and not as a mortal, right? Because they have this ability to change their shape, obviously, gods, I mean. But then this resulted in her literal disintegration because mortals cannot take in divinities in all their might, and this is very universal, very common in all religions. But as she was sort of I don't know, I guess being burnt alive, Zeus was able to save the fetus, which was Dionysus, because she was pregnant at the time, and then placed him inside his thigh, right, until he was until the right time for him to be born came. But this means that Dionysus is semi divine, like half mortal, half divine. Eventually, like Heracles, he has a same trajectory. He has the same trajectory like Heracles, right? He has to perform feats, like just like Heracles with his labors, in order to achieve godhood, because he is not initially fully God, because he is the son of Semele. He does this by performing his feats, and then he ascends. He ascends into godhood. So him ascending into godhood means that he becomes this 13th Olympian. So a lot of the scholars don't agree as to who the 12 gods actually were, who the 12 Olympians were, because if we add Dionysus, someone else has to leave, Hestia specifically. And sometimes scholars talk about how by the time that Dionysus's worship was, all the rage, Hestia's sort of fell off the radar. So in a way that he um, replaces her in the 12 Olympian.
Isn't that a modern myth though?
No,
That
that's actually
this replacement.
this replacement. So this is an older thought process. This is like older scholarship. Older scholarship believes
Yeah.
but this is actually now this has been disproven because there's actually no proof that Hestia's worship ever declined, because Hestia is worshiping who is Hestia? She's the hearth of the house. There is no way conceivably that people stopped worshiping Hestia in their homes. Like how do you trace that?
Yeah.
How do you know this? Um, so anyways, it's weird. The whole thing with Dionysus is weird. But in any case, this is what we know from Hesiod's myths. This is the most popular version. Orpheus tells us that Dionysus, as semi-divine, is the second Dionysus. The first being a different god, going by a different name, and being the son of Zeus again, but Persephone this time. So this god, Zagreus, is the son of Persephone, queen of the underworld, and Zeus as king of all the gods. Once he is born, Zagreus, Zeus names him as his successor. This whole thing, this very simple phrase, one might say, is very, very important, very seminal, because Zeus, as far as we could tell before these myths came to light, Zeus does not have a successor. Like that's sort of the whole point of Zeus's worship. When Zeus takes over after the Titans and the giants and he defeats Typhon, he becomes the supreme ruler, and none of his sons take over from him. In fact, he eradicates all threat to his throne by first
Yeah.
swallowing Metis and then giving birth to Athena and not a son, right? And so on and so forth and so on and so forth. And if you notice, his sons in the Olympian pantheon never actually marry. They are sort of stuck in liminal phases. Hermes is always the god of the preteen boy, right? Apollo is always the god of the youth. These gods do not marry, i.e., they're not completed. They don't become adults. Um,
What about Ares?
Ares is an interesting figure in general. The worship of Ares,
And he's the only male. He's the only male gods that he and Hera have too. That's another interesting thing.
but Ares as a god, I find him so interesting, even though he's very scary. Ares is very interesting. People don't know how he was worshipped, um, but what he represents, he also never marries. He does not. There's no myth talking about. He has relationships, of course, but he does not marry. He does not become someone's husband. And that is important because that means that he is not an adult. And in fact, where Ares is
Hmm.
found could not be conceivable, could not be the ruler of the universe because Ares is found in very specific spaces. That is the battlefield. That's where Ares is. That's
Yeah.
where he's worshipped. Ares is this might that you have to have in order to survive the battlefield. That's why he's the god of war, because Athena is also the goddess of war, but she's a goddess of war of a different aspect of war. Strategy. You still need strategy to win. Like you can survive all you want, but you need the strategy to win, right? But you can have all the strategy in the world, but you still need Ares to survive the actual war, the actual fighting. But that's his purview. That's his honor as a god, his demi. So it's very specific and very, in a way, limited.
Hmm.
And there's no tradition, there's no stories of him becoming, a full-on male in society.
I love this observation, and I never noticed it with how all the gods they don't marry, so they're not considered full adults in that sense that they can't take over. They can't overthrow Zeus in that sense.
Hmm.
I never noticed that.
This is not my thought. This is all the scholarship that I've studied. Most of the
Oh,
these
okay.
observation from scholars. The Ares is sort of what I sort of thought because no one really talks about Ares because everyone hates him. Which
Yeah,
I
and
find
philosophically, Ares is about conflict. He's what pull things apart.
yes,
You strife. He's strife. You have Eros and strife, and Ares is the strife. So you really can't have strife rule the cosmos. The cosmos would probably fall apart if Ares were to overthrow Zeus.
he's bloodthirsty. I mean that's his
Yeah,
whole point. Like he's doing something very specific, which is necessary to a certain extent, but cannot be ruler of all because it just cannot. It doesn't make
yeah.
sense. It has to be something else as well. There has to be something else as well because it's
So now why is
destruction,
the
right?
Dionysus? Oh, I'm sorry.
No, I mean that's destruction, not like
Hmm.
you need birth, you not destruction. So Dionysus actually does get married as well. He does. He
Yeah.
marries Ariadne, right? As I think most people know, also from the popular myths. So he's actually also someone who marries. But when Zagreus was born, let's go back to the story, right? Still a baby, and Zeus named him his successor, which is mind-boggling, right, for scholars in ancient Greek religion, because again, the whole point of Zeus is that it ends with him. There's no succession after him. So Hera, in her jealousy, instigates the Titans to go after Zagreus because she doesn't want Zagreus to become, the successor of Zeus. Um, the Titans succeed. I feel like if they hadn't, it would have been a very different world for us. But they succeed.
Hmm.
Zagreus at this point is still a baby. They lure him away from his mother. This is how the story goes, at least. They lure him away from his mother using toys. They also have asvesti, like I don't know how you say that in English, like white plaster on their faces to sort of
Yeah.
conceal themselves, lure him away, and then give him the toys. And the thing that scholars have noted that made the attack possible because they want to kill him. That's their end game. That's their goal. The thing that made this possible for them to strike was giving him a mirror. So giving Zagreus the baby a mirror. Why a mirror? Because once the baby looked at his reflection, for a split second, this is the danger of mirrors now. For a split second, he thought that he wasn't here, he was the mirror, he was in the mirror. So this thought that sort of this split his consciousness because he wasn't in the mirror, but he thought he was. It's
Yeah.
really weird. People who do work on mirrors and stuff will understand what I'm saying. But in any case, this is what allowed the Titans to strike because he thought the baby would that he was there. His consciousness was split and sort of divorced from him. So the Titans attacked. They dismembered him and devoured the pieces of his body. Hearing like hearing cries, hearing this, Zeus sees the crime happen, sees this crime, right? This ancestral crime, and I'll go into a minute why it's ancestral. Sees this happen, hurls his thunderbolt at the Titans. They turn to ash, and they were able to devour every piece of Zagreus except from his heart, which tradition says that Athena saved and then brought to Zeus, and then he then used this heart to have another child, this time with Semele, and implanted like this is so that's how Dionysus came to be also Semele's son. So he used this heart to Zeus to give birth to a second version of this god. Naturally, this time though, less powerful because now he is the son of a mortal, not the son of Persephone. Now, from the Titan's ashes, the Orphics believe arose humanity. This is where humans come from. In this way, humans have a dual nature, one titanic and corruptible, which is their body that is corrupted, right? That does not exist in eternity. And then their soul is the piece of Zagreus's body. So the thing that is immortal is the piece of this god, and that's our soul. So the idea of this cult is to understand where you come from as a human, understand where your soul comes from, understand that you are literally a part of Dionysus as a god, and then understand that you need to ask for forgiveness because the very existence now of humanity is an affront to Persephone because she, a goddess, lost a child, i.e., she um, experiences, she mourns. She's not supposed to mourn. Gods are blessed. They're blessed. They are not supposed to go through the same things that humans go through. So this is an affront. This is offensive. Like our very existence is offensive to Persephone. Um, that's why some of the tablets talk about gaining an audience with her and asking for her forgiveness and saying, in fact, the Bacchic one released me. So your son forgave me, released me, hence now you have to forgive me because I already paid the price. Um, yeah, so that's sort of the connection between that's who the Orphic Dionysus is. It sort of gives us more information on the stories that we know from Hesiod about who Dionysus is, and it becomes apparent that he is more important in the pantheon than initially believed by scholars.
So this is all very fascinating, and with Dionysus as a god, he's seen he's described as like a newcomer, but also like one of the oldest gods. In the text, he goes back to the Mycenaean period. So you have him appearing in the linear tablets, and then but he's also called like a newcomer in the classical period. Like, why? What do you think that is?
Yeah, I think that is part of this is a misconception by the scholars who believed that well there was this I don't there's issues here, but there's this idea, and I fault Nietzsche for this in his The Birth of Tragedy, where he talks about what the Greek psyche is, what it is about, that it's supposed to be Apolline. Apollo is the Greek god par excellence. This is who the Greeks revered, and not to fault Nietzsche. Of course, they revered Apollo is one of the most important gods for the ancient Greeks. He's right, but the juxtaposition that was placed upon this shining golden aspect and the dark, bloody, quite literally aspect, which is who is Dionysus, and that's what he he stands for. This dichotomy, though, did not exist, it turns out, for the ancients, not in the way that we think it actually did. But early on, early scholarship understood Dionysus as a newcomer because they believed that the Greeks are not like the Eastern cultures. They cannot have a god that is like this, cannot have a god that promotes ecstasy and enthusiasmos and takes women out of their bed to go dance in the mountaintops. Like, this is not Greek for these scholars of the 18th and 19th and even 20th centuries. Um, what is Greek? Apollo, the order, because also Zeus imposes order, right? This is the whole point of the Greek religion, is to impose order upon chaos. But people often forget that it's this imposition of order is done for humans, not for the gods. It's the world is the purview of the gods, upon which we become caretakers by having this understanding between the gods that for now, like, this city is for the humans. This ordered civilization is human. You, of course, God, have place in this because this is also yours. The minute I enter and exit this civilized and I go into the wild, that is the purview, that is the realm of beasts and gods, not of humans. Because the humans, the minute they go into the wild, they are in danger. But this is like we tend to forget that um, both of these are present in Greek religion, and they were always present. But because of what people in the 19th, 18th, 20th century thought about Greek religion, well, we got to the point where we started to talk about Dionysus as a newcomer, and in fact, he never was new. What happens when he comes back from the East, because he does go to the East, he is in the myths, right? He is initiated into the mysteries of the Mountain Mother in Asia Minor, that is Rhea, or otherwise known as Kybele. He is initiated into all of these mysteries of the goddess, and then he returns to Greece now as a god, not semi-divine, not as so.
Which version of the myth is this? Is this Nonnos?
This is in Nonnos. This is the most prevalent. Like, this is why Dionysus is talked about, especially in the Bacchae as well, because he's talked about as the foreigner who comes to Thebes and who comes to Greece spreading his worship. This is how he's talked about in the Bacchae, and this is what Pentheus, his cousin, is reacting to, the king of Thebes. But we forget that he's not coming newly to Thebes. His mother is from there.
Yeah.
Is from there. Like, half of him is from there. So he's not coming for the first time. He's returning. This time he's returning as a god, spreading his worship, yes, but as an entity, he returns. He's not a newcomer. So I think this in the ancient evidence is what prompted the scholars, earlier scholars, to talk about Dionysus as an Eastern deity, as a foreign deity, because Pentheus talks about him as a foreigner in the Bacchae. Again, the tyranny of the text.
Yeah.
Curiously, like, we don't talk about how his name appears in the Mycenaean Linear B tablets, because wine was a thing for the Mycenaean era, but Apollo, curiously, is not in the Mycenaean Linear B tablets at all. Not to say that he wasn't worshipped, but if he is the most important god, as the scholars thought, why don't we have a receipt from one of his temples? Because again, the linear
Yeah.
tablets are receipts, right? So why? We have Demeter, right? We have grain. We have Hephaestus, metalworking. We have most of the gods. Where's Apollo? So if we're talking in terms of those, that model, as you can see, starts to fall apart, and it
Yeah.
actually is not the prevailing theory now about the gods in scholarship.
And now I brought up Nonnos. So, what kind of depiction do we have of the Dionysus in this late antique text?
So the Dionysiaka, right? So Nonnos is a poet. He comes from the city of Pan, Panopolis, in Egypt, writing in the 5th century CE, we think. And we think also that he wrote the Dionysiaka, which is an epic hexameter poet, much like the Homeric epics. in 42 books, I believe. No, sorry, 44 books? The
It's a long epic.
however long the Iliad and the Odyssey is, that's how long the Dionysiaca is. Now, the other thing that is attributed to Nonnos of Panopolis is a how was this phrased? Is the Gospel of Saint John reworked, an epitome of the Gospel of Saint John, so like a smaller version of the Gospel, which talks about the life of Christ. So it's like, what is about who is this Nonnos, right? In the Dionysiaca, he it's a very interesting text. Um, we see every single myth that we know that has to do anything with Dionysus. He's collected them and put them in one narrative known as um, the Dionysiaca. So he begins from Zagreus, and then he gets to the point where Dionysus, semi-divine now, attempts to become a full-fledged god by defeating the Indian Empire, the empire of India, well, ancient India. So yeah, he ends with a figure that is actually connected with the worship of the goddesses at Ellipsis, having Iacchos, which is in other versions an epithet of Dionysus. In yet other versions, he is a different god connected to Dionysus. In Nonnos, we see that Iacchos becomes the third Dionysus or his son. Nonnos is not clear in the text. It's not clear what he means in the passages. But in any case, yet a third version of this god. Iacchos is connected to the goddesses at Ellipsis, so to Demeter and Persephone. So we see automatically, first of all, a connection between all the mystery cults in the persona of Dionysus. Even the Samothracian mysteries are connected to Dionysus. But essentially, that's what Nonnos is doing. In the text, he is collecting all of the stories on Dionysus and putting them in one continuous narrative to tell us who he is, where he comes from, and how he became a god.
And so I guess ultimately, who is Dionysus, and religiously he's a model for, I guess, for us as well. How do we become gods, right? In that sense, the mysteries, like what's the takeaway of Dionysus? Like he's telling you how to become a god, right?
That's a that's a very good question. I suppose he's telling you how to become a god, like the heroic gods, right? Like Heracles as well. He is supposed to be a benefactor of humanity. But this side of things, the Orphic side of things, give us more information. Like we are a part of him, um, quite literally in this belief. So we're supposed to return to him in a way. So I don't know. I've been thinking about this myself quite a lot, and it looks like I don't know. Will we like be completely absorbed by him in our death? Is the Elysian Fields a myth? Or are we simply to be taken into his divinity, to his body, and to be completely eradicated, right? I don't know. I don't know. It could be both, but the point is that what he stands for is that dark side of humanity that you cannot ignore, and if you ignore, it's to your detriment. It will overcome and it will claim your life in one way or another. So I guess what he says is don't turn your back on the dark because it will come out and bite you.
Katerina, thank you so much for being on the podcast. This was a great conversation. Where can we follow you, or what are you working on currently if people want to keep track of your work?
Um, I'm not sure. I don't know actually. I guess you can check my profile, my little bio on the University of Toronto website. Um, I don't have any other official platform. You can email me if you'd like, and my email is on the University of Toronto website. So
Okay, very good. Thank you again.
thank you so much for having me. This was awesome.